Alright, so here is where we'll begin the assembly of the Ugly Naked Guy Hobo Bag in the large size. I have everything cut and interfaced. I'm using a double brushed poly knit fabric for my exterior, which I still adhered 2 layers of woven interfacing to the back, so now it's not stretchy. And then for my strap and my base and my connectors, I'm using this, I think it's called Crinkle Faux Leather from So Hungry Hippie. And okay, so 2 layers of Decovil and then Shape Flex over the top. If you're using any kind of a vinyl, make sure that you test it by ironing it from the wrong side on a scrap first to make sure that it won't melt. I've ironed onto the wrong side of a lot of vinyl now and it hasn't melted, so, but definitely test it first. So I have all my pieces ready to go. The first thing that we'll do is make the connectors and the strap, because that's always nice to get that out of the way first. Okay, so as the directions begin with step 1, you are taking a handle connector and pressing it in half. Since this is a crinkle faux leather, I can't iron this, so I went ahead and I drew a line down the center, and I just used a ruler 2 inches in from the edge. And now I'm going to use some double-sided tape and I'll do this on both connectors, and then the strap will be assembled the same way as well. If you have, if you're making your strap and your connectors out of cork or a different vinyl that's thick, you may want to cut your connectors differently so that they're not so thick to sew into the seam. This vinyl is still relatively thin, so I think it'll be fine this way. But if your vinyl was thicker, you would just cut a 2-inch wide by 3-inch strip, and then you would just fold each half into the center and then fold that in half, rather than folding into fourths as we'll do here. So I'll remove the tape. All right, and then press each 2-inch raw edge into the line that you drew. Or if you pressed it in half now, if it's fabric, then you would press each raw edge to the center and you would iron this, and then you'll fold in half again and iron that. So I'm going to put one more strip of tape. All right, and then we'll fold that in half. Okay, so now you have a connector that is 1 inch wide by 3 inches long. I'm going to do the same for the other one. And I'm keeping the tape away from the very edge so that I'm not sewing through it all along the top stitching. This tape does tend to leave a little gumminess on the needle, which you can just like kind of scrape off, but I like to avoid it. Okay, now you will top stitch each long folded edge of the connector. For top stitching, I like to use like a stitch length of 4 to 5. This is 5, which is the longest I can get on my machine, which is what I use for vinyl. And I just used a 1/8 inch seam allowance. And this crinkle faux leather, or I'll have to look and see what it's called. It's really easy to sew. So I know I have an industrial machine, but it compresses fairly thin, so you'd be able to sew this without a problem on any domestic machine as well. And it doesn't seem like you would need a Teflon foot or anything, or a walking foot. It's just really easy. And look how pretty. So once you've top stitched that, then you can press this connector in half, or just fold it in half, and place your rectangle ring into the crease, and then you'll sew across the bottom using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we do use that seam allowance as a guide later on, so it's important to keep it 1/4 inch. You'll notice that I try to trim all my threads as I go, so that way when I finish I don't have to go through and trim a bunch of threads off my bag. Quarter inch seam allowance. Aren't those pretty? Okay, and then for the strap will be the same thing. So I'm going to run a strip of tape down each side of the center line, which I just drew the line by measuring in 2 inches from the long raw edge. Alright. And this double-sided tape is double-sided leather tape from Tandy Leather. No, it's from Whack. Their rolls are a little bigger, so it lasts longer. I do like the double-sided tape from Tandy Leather as well. And those are really the only two that I've used personally. I know there are other brands available. And I'm just taking each of the long raw edges and bringing them to that center line. I keep them like just the tiniest bit, like maybe a 1/16 of an inch away from each other. And that just makes it so your strap folds nicer. So there isn't too much material in the center seam. After I get it stuck down, I always just press everything down well. And if you were using fabric, you would iron this in half, open that up, press both long raw edges into the center crease, and then iron that, and then fold in half and press that. So this is the same technique. or the same manner of constructing the strap. I'm just taping everything since I can't press it. So if you were using cork or vinyl, this would be the way you'd want to do it. You don't want to iron that. Alright, now I'll just fold this in half. And if your vinyl was really thin, you be the judge on if you think it needs any kind of interfacing. If it's not something you can iron onto the back, then you could glue it on. But I think this will be fine on its own. Alright, and for the large bag, once you have the strap all folded, it is 24 inches long by 1 inch wide. For the small bag, it's 20 inches long by 1 inch wide. And again, I just have a stitch length of 5 right now, and I'm just top stitching down both of the long folded edges. I think this bobbin I put in here didn't have much on it, so hopefully it doesn't run out while I'm in the middle of the strap, because that's how it usually works. Alright, now because I don't want to take that risk, I actually have another bobbin made up, so I'm going to switch it out, and then, oh yeah, so close. Do you see how much thread is left on that? It's a good decision. Okay. Okay, so now my strap's done. My strap connectors are done, so now we'll go on to actual bag assembly. Isn't this the prettiest faux leather you've ever seen? Reminds me of mermaids or something. Alright. Put this out of the way. So we want to start now with the 2 back center panels. So those are exterior pieces. And then we'll also have, going to find all of my exterior pieces that will, okay. So first we want to place these right sides together, matching all edges. And then we are going to pin or clip together along the shorter of the 2 long edges. And for my assembly steps, I use a shorter stitch length, so I'll change that to probably 3.5. And then you'll just want to clip together this shorter edge. Just like that. And now we're going to sew this together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you want to make sure that you back stitch at the top and bottom. 1, 2. And now you will press the seam allowance open. So let me press that real quick. Okay, so I have that seam allowance pressed open, so it's nice and flat. And then from the right side, you will top stitch 1/8 of an inch down each side of the seam. So on this part, it's important, make sure you start all the way at the very edge of the fabric so that your stitching doesn't come out at the end. And you want a longer stitch length. So I changed mine to 5. All right, and you will, I guess depending on, the top stitching is a feature of this bag, so a contrasting color can look really good as long as you sew nice straight lines, so really just take your time. I'm using purple. I thought that would maybe add a little bit of visual interest and also not be completely contrasting, like white on black, which can be a little bit scary. Okay. So these are the back center panels. And then we're going to repeat that same process with the front, let's see, the front center top panels. We will place them right sides together and then stitch together along the short edge. Going to throw a couple clips on there, especially since I'm using this knit fabric and it stretches. I want to be extra careful to make sure that it doesn't stretch while I'm sewing it. I mean, it does have interfacing on it, so it's not super stretchy now, but make sure you back stitch there. Okay. And then I'm just going to also sew these together. So this one, decide which way you want your pattern to be. Like I want these stars, I think maybe at the top like that. So I'll push or put these two sides together and I'll top stitch here. And these are really just rectangles, so it doesn't matter. Just one of the longer two edges you'll put right sides together and sew together. Make sure everything's lined up. Again, I really just don't want this to stretch at all. My stitch length is still shorter. And then I'll just press both of these open and do all the top stitching at once. And I'm moving my clips to the very edge of the fabric, so that way I can leave them on as I sew and minimize risk of anything shifting or stretching. Alright, now I will press these seams open. Alright, and now we will top stitch using a 1/8 inch seam allowance again along each side of the center seam, and my stitch length is on 5. Trim my threads away. Okay, so now if you choose to reduce bulk, you can trim away the excess seam allowance that's in the back. If your machine can't handle bulk well, that wouldn't be a bad idea. I'm going to leave it, but just be careful not to trim through the panel, but you can trim this away here. Okay, so now that those are all together, that's step 3. On to step 4, we are going to sew together the side panels. So you'll take 2 mirrored side panels. Let me decide how I want these. This one has a lot of stars, so I'll do one with a lot and one with not a lot together. So we're going to place these right sides together, and we're actually sewing along the longer edge that has the curve at the bottom. Once all the pieces are sewn together, it really is pretty quick. Just a lot of piecing, but the piecing of all of this makes it look interesting, and it also could be color blocked. So if you want to use a variety of fabrics, that could be really cute. Again, I'm just going to pull my clips to the edge of the fabric so that I can just sew right next to them and leave them on so it doesn't stretch. My stitch length will be set at a 3.5. Make sure you back stitch at the start and stop. Alright, now I'm going to sew the other 2 side panels together the same way. Right sides together. And then clip along the longer edge that has the curve at the bottom. And I'll scoot those clips just out to the edge a little bit so I can sew next to them again. Remove all those clips. Now I'm going to press these seams open. The bottom of this is curved, so it'll be a little bit, it's not going to press flat. It will be kind of curved up at the bottom, just like that. So I'm going to press these open though. Alright, those seams are both pressed flat. You see how the bottom edge curves up, and that helps to give the bag its shape. So now we'll just top stitch at a 1/8 inch seam allowance along both sides of that seam. Once again, stitch length of 5. And this bag really works well with solid fabrics or something that has like an all over non-organized print. Definitely easier than something that has like geometric or like a lined up print on it that you'd want to line up when you piece everything together. I really just love it with solid fabric. I think it would look really nice with like a very thin leather so that it's still slouchy. Oh, or some of that crinkle vinyl or crinkle metallic faux leather from So Hungry Hippie. That would be amazing on this whole bag. All right, everything is pieced and top stitched. We're on to step 5. So now with the assembled front, center, bottom, right side up, let's see, the assembled front, bottom, center, and there's the top. Let me set the rest of that aside. I think, so we want here to use a 10-inch zipper or a 11-inch zipper total length if it's zipper tape for the large bag. If you're using the small bag, then you will have an 8-inch zipper or 9-inch length of zipper tape. So I have zipper tape. And I will want to cut an 11-inch section. All right. If it's a little bit longer, you can trim it off. Not a big deal. Okay, and to place the zipper pull onto the zipper, just separate it slightly and then place the open end of the zipper onto the tape and then put the other end in. Look in there, make sure it's lined up, and then just pull it on. Super simple. So that's it. So we will place it right side down. This zipper tape is from Blue Calla Patterns, and it is 1 1/4 inch wide. So when we do this step, we will use a 3/8 inch seam allowance. If your zipper tape is 1 inch wide, you'll use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm just going to clip this all together. Okay. Your zipper will be just a touch smaller, shorter. It's fine because that'll be in the seam allowance when we're done. So we're going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance and stitch right along the top of the zipper. And I use, I'm going to use a 3.5 stitch length for this. And if you need to switch out to a zipper foot, then you'd want to do that now. I use the super narrow foot for everything, so I don't have to change often, usually when I sew bottom panels, but and I really don't have a 3/8 inch mark on my sewing machine, so I just have a spot that I know is close, and that's what I always use. Now we want to, oh, and also if you need to move the zipper out of the way as you go, you can do that. Now we want to take a lining, pocket lining panel, and place it right side down so the zipper is in between. And we will just clip together along that top edge only. And I'm clipping it with the clips upside down so that I can sew from the edge where I see the stitching, and then I'll just sew directly over that stitching. Okay, as such, I can see my purple stitching, and everything should be nice and lined up. And now just stitch right over top that stitching. If you need to reach in there when you get to the zipper and move that out of the way, you can do that. Okay. Trim my threads. And now we're going to go to the iron and press both panels away from the zipper, so that they are wrong sides together and pressed flat away from the zipper. Okay, I've pressed that away from the zipper, the lining and the exterior. And now I will top stitch along the bottom edge of the zipper using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. I do all of my top stitching using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. If you chose to use like something longer, a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you just want to be consistent and do that throughout the whole bag so that all of your decorative top stitching is consistent and matches. Okay, now we will take the top, let's see, step 8. This is the front center top, and we will place that right side down on top of the zipper. You want to make sure here that your center seam matches up. So I first match the center seam, and I'm going to clip that, and then I'll clip the rest of the way, and then I actually threw a couple pins in the one that I used, or the one that I made when I was making the pattern. I put a couple pins here as well to really just make sure that that center seam stays lined up, because you don't want the center seam on the front of your bag to be not lined up. I mean, unless you do want it not lined up, and then that's up to you, I guess. Okay. I'm going to make sure again that's lined up, and it is. I'm just going to go ahead and hope that it stays. I'll, yes, move my zipper out of the way. And again, I'm using a 3/8 inch seam allowance here, since my zipper is 1 1/4 inch wide. If your zipper is only 1 inch wide, you'll use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I did move my zipper out of the way. Now I'll move it back. Hopefully that stayed lined up. threads. Double check now to make sure that your seam allowance is lined up. Alright, so now you want to grab your other pocket lining panel and place it right side together with the other pocket panel. And you will pin or clip along the top edge. And I'm putting my clips on again upside down so that I can sew from the other side directly over the stitching from the last step. Alright, move my zipper out of the way. Move my zipper back. Alright, now I'm going to press both the top panel and the other lining panel away from the zipper, so it will be like this. Okay, I pressed both the top center panel and the top lining panel away from the zipper, and now we're going to top stitch through both of those. Go from this side. Okay, so now we will press the top lining panel down flat so that it covers the back of the zipper, and it's right sides together with the other lining panel. Okay, so now you have this. From the right side it looks like this, and from the wrong side it looks like that. You have this section of lining pocket that extends past the other lining pocket. So what you'll do right here is just trim them to be even with each other. Okay. And now you will pin together just the bottom of that pocket. So those two pocket panels. Front pocket lining panels. So now we're going to sew together just those two panels. So you see I flipped the exterior out of the way. So just those together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm using my shorter stitch length for this. Trim my threads. Alright, now you'll bring the pocket down flat with the exterior of the bag, and we're just going to clip along the sides, and we're going to base the pocket in place. Okay, now we'll use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to baste along each of the sides, and you can use my thread is caught in my foot somewhere. Okay, you can use your longest stitch length for that, and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, now I'll do the other side of the front pocket. Okay, so now we have the front center section of the bag is completely assembled. And now we'll assemble the entire exterior. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, your front panel, your assembled front panels should be the same height as your assembled back panel. Mine wasn't, but I also am just now testing out this large size as I go, so okay, it's all good now. All right, so you will place right sides together, your assembled front panel and assembled one set of assembled side panels, and pin together along the long straight edge. And this edge is actually straight, not curved, but it feels a little weird where you clip it at the end. But you are actually clipping a straight edge, so. Okay. And now we will sew, oops, I just threw 2 of my panels away. Okay. I'm going to put my machine back on a 3.5 inch stitch length. And sew this together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You're sewing directly over the zipper when you get to that. And make sure that you back stitch at the start and stop. Okay, you want to press this side panel away from the front center panels, and it will be, the seam allowance will be pressed toward the side panel. So you're not, yeah, the seam allowance is here. Press this away from there. I will actually sew the other side panel on first, and then I'll press both. Okay, so I'm going to clip on the other side panel. Okay, sew that together again using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, and then I will press that side panel away from the front panel as well. And seam allowances are both toward the side panels. Okay, both seams are pressed. And now you will top stitch using a 1/8 inch seam allowance and a longer stitch length just through the side panel and the seam allowance in the back. You will not be top stitching on the front panels. And then we'll top stitch the other side, again just through the side panel and seam allowance, not through the front panels at all. My threads. Now you will take your back center panels and place that, oh wait, first we want to attach our connectors. We go in order here. So you have your strap connectors that you already assembled. You will place them each at the top of the side panels along the center seam, centered along that flat portion. And the stitch line where you stitch the ends of the connector together at a 1/4 inch will be lined up with the edge of the fabric. So 1/4 inch of the connector is actually sticking off of the bag. And you just want to make sure that that's centered over the stitching, over the seam. And then you'll base that in place using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so it will be a 1/4 inch below the other stitching that's on the connector. And you just leave that part hanging off there. And that's just for added security. And then we'll do the other one the same way. It is extended past the edge of the fabric by a 1/4 inch. Centered over the seam. And then we'll just stitch it on a 1/4 inch below the other stitching. Okay, now that both of the connectors are attached, you will take your center assembled back center panels, place it right sides down on top of one of the side panels. And we're going to clip it in place. my stitch length to 3.5. And now we're just going to sew this together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, and now you'll press that seam allowance toward the side panel again. We're almost done assembling the exterior. Oops, I'm stuck. Okay, and now you'll top stitch through the side panel and the seam allowance on the side panel only, not on the center panel. So longer stitch length. Okay, and then we have one more. Now we're going to bring the back center panel all the way over to the other side panel, right sides together. So we're creating a big fabric loop. We will pin that in place along the straight edge. This way will be easier. The curve of the side panels at the bottom there, it makes this want to kind of go weird, so okay. Oh, I want to use a 3.5 stitch length for this. Okay, so now you have one continuous big bag loop. We are going to, from the inside, press the seam allowance to that side seam. I'm sorry, press it to the side panel. I'm being careful not to touch my handle connector since I use that faux leather. Okay, now this will be the trickiest top stitch because we're top stitching inside of this loop of exterior of the bag. So you just want to top stitch again along the side panel and through the seam allowance, right along that seam. So you'll just move the other part of the bag out of the way as you go. Now remember, this is the large bag, so this is probably a little bit easier than the small bag. But always when you stop with the needle down so that nothing slides out of place and that your seams or your top stitching stays nice and straight. So now we have a whole bag loop, no bottom. I'm going to grab my bottom panel and my bottom panel pattern piece. And now I will mark I'm going to mark on the wrong side. My chalk. Okay, I have a chalk pencil from Dritz. I will put the pattern piece on the wrong side of my exterior bottom panel. Line it up, mark the centers on each short side, and then I have a mark here to mark the center on the long, well, this is the short side, whatever, mark all 4 centers. Again here, just fold that back, and there's your center mark. So I have all 4 centers marked. And now on the bottom of the bag, I will place the bottom panel right sides together with the bag exterior. This is the center back seam, and I'm matching that with one of the center marks along the longer edge of the panel. And my bottom panel is right sides together. And we will sew this with the bottom panel against the presser foot, so I put my clips that way. So I'm going to clip once at that center mark, and then clip a couple more times right alongside it. Okay, and then I'm going to flip it over, and you have your center seam along the front. So I will just, and your pocket panel should be a little bit shorter than mine. That's because of, yeah, it's adjusted now. The pattern is not complete yet. It's still being tested as I make this video, which gives me an opportunity also to test it out once again myself. So your pocket will be a little bit shorter than that. Okay, and then I'm going to match the end mark with the side seam, and everything should fit snugly right around that bottom panel. And this is where I'll put my zipper foot on to sew the bottom panel in place so that I can get really close to that bottom panel stabilizer and use that as a guide for my sewing. Okay. Grab some more clips. And the last portion. Okay. All right, everything looks good. So I'm going to switch over to my zipper foot. And this will allow me to get super close to that bottom panel stabilizer. You want to sew right next to that, but not through it. I have my seam allowance, or my stitch length is set to 3.5. And you have the bottom panel facing up towards your presser foot. And this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I just take the clips off as I go. Make sure everything stays nice and lined up. I would start along the longer edges first since they're easier. And then I put my arm inside the bag as I sew up around the ends so that I can maneuver the bag from the inside as well. And I just adjust the bag so it goes right around the curve. I lift the whole thing up off the sewing machine bed. And we will, once we're finished sewing this seam, we will trim this seam allowance at the bottom. I think after this video, I'm going to, after the exterior, I will take a break for lunch, and then we'll go ahead and the next video will be sewing the lining portions and then the final assembly of the bag. Okay, I'm going to look inside first before I trim the seam allowance and make sure that everything looks really good. If you have any puckers in your seam, you'll want to stitch, or you'll want to seam rip that first and then fix it before you trim your seams, your seam allowance. Okay, looks perfect. I kind of love this bag, and it's big. I'm not a big bag person. I like small bags, but might keep this for myself. All right, let me get my other scissors that are better. So now you're just going to trim the seam allowance down to, I usually trim it to between like 1/4 and 1/8 of an inch. I need new scissors, I think. These I must have cut over something, like a pin or something at some point, because there's a nick in the blade. My Ginger scissors are, I think, just beyond their life now. Alright, so my seam allowance is trimmed. You'll leave this inside out. So your whole exterior is completed though. And in the next video, we will assemble the interior and then place the zipper at the top of the bag, hook both together, and add the handle.